In the marketing science, they call it mental and physical availability. So what is more mentally available to you? Easy to mind, easy to find. Starbucks is always going to be easy to mind. You're going to remember this is Starbucks, it's going to be coffee, it's going to be this, it's going to be that, because it's so big in your mind. And it's easy to find because they've got physical availability, they're everywhere. So that's how they build repeat customers, which people might call loyalty. So I'd be considered, Starbucks' most loyal consumer, not because I want to, not because I like them at all, but because of that availability.
Welcome to the Global Affair podcast, brought to you by Love Out Loud, the world's largest love-based movement actualizing a civilization of love by 2030. My name's Nicole Gibson, and join me and some of the world's brightest minds as we bring some of the most important and controversial conversations of our time into a space of unity. It's important to know that as your host, this isn't about my personal opinion or bias, but rather an opportunity to listen with love, honesty, curiosity, and reveal the true universal experience us humans have amongst the differences. So if you love the show, please let us know by giving us a rating and tell us how to make this conversation easier for other people to jump into as well. And with that, let's get it. Clinton Barnes, welcome to the Global Affair. I love branding and I love psychology. I know selfishly I'm really going to enjoy this episode. What fascinates me about your work is from our conversations, we met in New York not so long ago. You really helped me understand just how our psychology, no matter the industry you work in, affects everything, our approach to everything. That human psychology really has levels of predictability no matter where you apply it. And I think that's super interesting. And for all of the people that, are running businesses, entrepreneurs, etc., listening to the Global Affair, I want you to really listen close to some of the wisdom that Clinton's going to share. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicole. What a great introduction. Yeah, we've got to put the human into branding.
I agree. I think we've got to put the human into most things. And that's what's, lacking in so many industries. But Clinton, when did it begin for you? You're an Aussie who's now living in New York, running a branding agency. Let's hear a bit about your why and your mission.
Yeah. So I really got interested in marketing actually because I was concerned with social change and I wanted to make a difference in the world. A very familiar millennial story. And one of the things that first caught my eye as a messaging change was how they changed global warming to climate change. And I thought that messaging change had an impact in how we felt about it. So I knew the importance of marketing. So I started off in a lot of purpose-led organizations. I was working at YWCA Sydney, and then I launched the Social Justice and Inclusion Center at UTS. But it was when I got to New York that I found that there was just so much more to culture and branding. And I did a rebranding project on Smirnoff, of all things. I just found myself, it was like a classic New York story, finding connections and then working on Smirnoff. And I was like, this is really cool, talking about culture and conversations and understanding how people are represented in branding. I was surprised that I was doing that, especially given my sort of social justice background. But I found a lot of enjoyment in understanding culture and behavior and getting deeper into that.
And what were the biggest things that shifted your paradigm of understanding when you did that project? What was it about that project where you were like, wow, there's so much more to the branding story than maybe you had learned at university or previously in your career?
Yeah, well, Smirnoff is just such a funny brand because it was all about the noticing of the impact of branding and marketing on people. So I did a lot of tests in New York where I would go out to a bar and I would ask people for a Smirnoff vodka in my drink. And I remember there's one bar in Brooklyn, the person leant over, they clearly heard that I had an accent and they were sort of like, oh, let me just help you out. But people don't actually drink that in bars. You shouldn't be asking for that. And I was like, oh, what should I have? And they were like, oh, well, here's some Well vodka. I'm like, what? How is that for people who don't know, Well vodka is the absolute cheapest sort of no-name brand vodka in a bar. I'm like, how is that better than Smirnoff? But it really told me the act of noticing with brands and how they fit into culture and how they mean things to people. And Smirnoff means partying. It means like lack of restraint. It means all these things that poor Smirnoff was trying to get away from. And then, Tito's means artisanship and American entrepreneurialism and the spirit of America. And basically they're the same product at the end of the day.
I find this interesting. So Smirnoff, and was this a direct sort of aspect that you were actually working on when you did that campaign? They were trying to get away from this more traditional image. And it's totally true, by the way. I think about Smirnoff and associate it to all of the messy high school parties I attended when I was 15. And, you know, people throwing up in people's backyards. That is definitely my association. But, you know, as a brand, how was this handled? And what did that kind of teach you about what it takes to actually maybe shift brand identity once there is those associations in place?
Yeah. I mean, it's just so fascinating, and it's such a great product because it's all branding. So yeah, we were all about shifting away from the party culture, dialing down the neon lights, dialing down the dark photography and in clubs and bars, that kind of image, and trying to show that this is a drink that you can enjoy responsibly because of the whole, you know, reducing alcohol intake that culture has shifted towards. You don't have to get really drunk on this. And in fact, they don't want that kind of association. So it was dialing all that back, dialing back the party culture. And it's such a long process in culture to actually shift that perception because, to your point, it's still there. But it's probably, I mean, the thing with alcohol is it sort of has a bit of a life cycle where whatever you drink when you started drinking is what you don't drink when you're in your late 20s because you cringe at it. But then the next generation will forget. And so I imagine like Gen Alpha will be like, you know what, Smirnoff's sort of cool, you know, like, because they will have forgotten all those associations. So yeah, it was really interesting seeing how people reacted to it.
That is so telling about the psychological element of branding, though, that by the time we reach our late 20s, we no longer want to be associated with the brands that we associated with as a teenager, even though, you know, what the product might be is relatively ambivalent in terms of age. Just purely from an identification standpoint, we no longer want to be associated with that. And so I guess my question here was the noticing of that, was that your kind of real introduction and fascination with the psychological elements of brand?
Yeah, like figuring stuff out. I just find those little funny things that people do just so interesting. And I love like just studying cultures, just noticing, oh, why did you do it like that instead of like that? And, you know, even talking to clients, it usually leads me to really interesting discoveries. I noticed this healthcare client, they kept on referring to, patients as members. And I pulled them up and I said, like, why are you calling them members and not patients? And they said, well, because we don't want people to identify as being sick. We want them to identify as being healthy because we think the current industry is very sick care oriented rather than healthcare. I was like, wow, what an amazing revelation from just the fact that they were saying members instead of patients. So we got to that insight really quickly that they're focused on healthcare rather than sick care. So yeah, it's noticing all those little details that I just love because I love to try to understand the world because I feel like from a young age, I didn't really feel like I did understand all these norms. You know, I often sort of have an affinity with people who identify or experience autism. I've always wanted to know, okay, why do we have to do that? Why do we shake hands? Or why do we do this? And when you ask those right questions, you uncover something about the culture, then it uncovers something about what matters to people. Yeah,
I think that's so accurate. And I've heard you say kind of numerous times in our conversation that you really like to stick to the science behind branding. And so my next question is kind of twofold. When you are introduced to a brand for the first time, both as a branding expert that's being employed to kind of deconstruct that brand, but also as a consumer, what are the first things you notice based on what you know about the science of branding? And then I want to get into the actual kind of facts behind branding themselves.
Yeah, the first question I have for myself when I'm looking at a brand is, people usually do this, you know, when I tell them I'm a brand strategist, they will shove their logo in front of my face and be like, what do you think of that? And it's usually like, well, I need to understand your competitors in your category and your set and understand
Try
what you're
being
trying
a
to say.
mental health expert, Clinton.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably guilty of that talking to you anyway, Nicole. I'm sort of offloading. But I mean, I love offloading and hopefully not
love your stories
kind of way. But you don't want to be too vulnerable with people too quickly. That's smash and grab vulnerability, as Brené Brown calls it. So people shove their logo in front of my face. And the first thing I think of is distinctiveness. How distinctive are you? And how do you relate to other brands? And usually the thing is people will try to blend in. And it's this funny thing about, you know, human nature as well, where we want to blend in, and then we say, why isn't anyone noticing us? And it's like, well, you tried to blend in really hard. You did a really good job of it. You were really successful in blending in.
Amen.
Yeah. We want to be appreciated for our individuality. We want to be seen. We want to be understood. And yet we starch out all the individuality in what we are. And brands do this too. And I remember another client, they're an architecture firm, and they first came to us saying, oh, we want to be like really cool and creative. We want to be seen as like cutting edge designers and creatives. And I was sort of thinking, you don't really seem to be coming across like that. But like as people. But then I looked at their work and I was like, some of this is really cool. Some of it is really bland. And then we got into a bit deeper and we realized that they're very responsive to their customer's vision. And they're great at executing what people's vision is. And I thought, well, that's an amazing trait. You don't get your ideas in the way and you just make people sort of express themselves. Like, what a great thing. And yet they didn't really want to own that before I engaged with them. But I said, like, this is really cool, and own it. Own what you're about. So that's the thing I noticed at the first level.
There's something really interesting actually in what you just shared. And it was kind of, I don't even think fully intentional, but you're noticing immediately when you met them of like, well, as people, you don't really seem cutting edge. What's your kind of insight or take around the importance of a founder, I think in particular, but also a team at large, really being the embodiment of what they say their brand is about?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is so important. And it's interesting because this is where I have to get out of the way myself, because I have an idea of what a good brand would be in this space. And this is actually what I love about my job, because I'm not trying to change people. I'm just trying to help them be reflected in the world as accurately as possible. And the really core reason for that is because they're not going to execute on a brand that they don't congruent with. Yeah, they're going to do a really great job at being themselves, which sort of sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how it's hard to get people to be like, I'm just like, be yourself. So I try to talk about themselves in a compelling way that makes them feel good about who they are, which is sort of the nice part of my job. Like people say, when I tell them what their brand is, they feel so seen. And one woman was like crying in a meeting. It was really like people just want to feel seen, which is, basically I'm giving to other people what I want to be given myself. And yeah, that congruency, as you were saying, is so important for representing authentically to the world, because you can't really fool people. They're going to work it out. They're going to work out what your brand is about and what you're about. And you might be able to fool them over a short term, but you can't fool them over the long term.
I think that really leads into kind of the second part of this question, based on some of the things we were talking about leading into this interview around part of the kind of fundamentals or the science of branding around building a long-term brand actually comes down to authenticity and honesty. And I found that to be a really kind of hopeful message, because it's definitely a connotation, right? I think where advertising and marketing is more about kind of manipulation and coercion. And from your experience, you actually see a bit of a different trend.
Yeah. From what I've read, so a lot of the research says that over the long term, lying isn't as effective as honesty in branding and in marketing, because people experience the product and it's not what you said it was. And that's really hopeful to hear about humanity, really, that we don't like suffer fools over the long term. And it's good to have that kind of data. This comes from some IPA research in the UK by Peter Burnett and Les Field. Or was it Les Burnett and Peter Field? It is Les Burnett and Peter Field. Anyway, in the UK, they're these very famous marketing scientists, and they researched about hundreds of campaigns over 20 years. And that's what they found, that the dishonesty in campaigns isn't as effective.
And do you think that's because, from your point of view, it's more difficult for the people within that culture to sustain something inauthentic, and then eventually it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy from the inside out? Or do you think it's because the consumer genuinely has, a savvier discernment, maybe, than we've been led to believe?
Oh, yeah. I mean, working with so many marketers, I hate to say this about my profession, but I feel like as humans, we do this all the time too. I think we think people are stupider than they are. I think people are a bit smarter than we think in general, but people are lazier than we expect. And I think a lot of marketers confuse laziness for stupidity. And I think you need to respect the consumers a lot more than that. But I mean, the thing is, when it comes to, marketing that is misleading or leads into stereotypes, I think there is a propensity for people to sometimes want to believe certain things. And I think that's the bigger problem that perhaps marketing can't really solve for.
Go into what you mean by that. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it's quite a statement. That's why I'm being cautious on it. I mean, for instance, when we're putting together campaigns, the most important thing is to tap into what people already know about something. So when we always build on what people know, it's how people a lot of the time learn new things when they're not paying a lot of attention, which is what people are doing in marketing. So they've got low attention. And so they wanted to see something that they half understand, and then you can build something new on that. That's why a lot of startups will say, we're the Uber of whatever, or we're the Tinder of whatever. They're trying to hook into, you already know this thing, and I'll give you some new information on top of that. So that's how stereotypes happen. That's how like sort of lazy ideas about society happen, because we're building on what people know, because we've got a low cognitive focus on the messaging.
I think that's, so accurate that it is really ultimately detrimental to society to try to eliminate kind of nuance of difference. I know for us as a company, one of the things that I'm constantly driving the team to really try to think differently towards and innovate around is with a company name like Love Out Loud. It comes with a barrage of, assumptions and associations and cliches. So one of the approaches I've taken with our brand is it's black and white, as a logo. It's quite androgynous. There's no pink. There's no love hearts. We've basically tried to de-gender and neutralize this idea of love and reintroduce it in a new way. And that's been a very big kind of point of focus that we're trying to bring more nuance into the conversation of love, because we believe as a company that it's been far too romanticized. It's too associated with Hollywood and Disney. And truly, from a brand positioning perspective, it's been one of the hardest challenges and hurdles, and also one of the areas I'm most proud of.
Yeah, I love that thinking. I've just been nodding along, and then I'm realizing people can't see my nods. But I really love that thinking, because what you're doing is you're doing exactly that. You're taking something people already know, and then you're taking them to a slightly next step. Like, here's another next step. Weirdly, it reminds me of that. This is like such a tangential thing to remind me of, but there's some kind of TV show called Our Flag Means Death, and it's written in a sort of piratey sort of font, and it's about pirates. And I think it's about gay pirates, if I'm correct. So what I'm getting at there is that they took something that people already know, which is they know the skull and bones means pirates, and they changed it. They put it in pink font. And so they're like, this is something you know, but it's going to be slightly different. So it's that thing of meeting people where they are. And this also means that you get a broader audience too, because people don't have to be fully on board and on your journey and invest in what you're about to even just get in the door. Like, that's a high bar to be like, you have to love everything that Love Out Loud is about. You have to be on board with that purpose from day one. And it's like, well, just give me a second to understand what you're about and try to learn more and then become a fan.
I think that that's like so valuable for people to understand and hear that, one of our most senior roles in the company, and this is intentional and strategic because of my personal passion for brand. I think what has separated some of the most successful companies from companies that may be on a technical level, product development level, were as good is brand. How much people want to identify or how much they relate to your brand. So one of our most senior positions is head of brand and experience. And the thinking in that role, shout out to you, Anita, is really about how every single touch point that someone might meet Love Out Loud, that there's a complete experience that we've intentionally curated from that point on. So what is the experience? What are they going to feel when they first meet Love Out Loud? Whether that's through the podcast, through other content, through seeing me talk, through using our technology, whatever it is. What's that immediate first impression? And then how do we actually hold their hand and nurture them through a user journey? And we really try to make that as intentional as possible. And it's amazing how difficult that actually is to achieve as a company and a brand.
Yeah. I mean, what are some of the difficulties you've found in that in particular?
I think when a company is trying to execute on, multiple projects and your team grows, to ensure that there's a total coherence, that anyone looking from the outside in is going to have a similar experience, of Love Out Loud and a consistency of experience. far from impossible, but definitely something that I've found takes really a lot of intentional consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, I love how you're thinking about it because it's the details. It's getting those details right. And you're absolutely right. Branding is consistency. Branding is also it's also an efficiency. So, you were saying before that sometimes not so good products win out because they've got a better brand. And it's the efficiency of that branding. It says, this is what we're about clearly, and you'll remember it and you'll come back to us because you know what to expect. It's, since we're both Australians, I just want to talk about coffee for a second. And I mean espresso coffee, of
Yes.
course.
Let's talk about coffee. Great.
Let's talk about coffee because it's
How
really funny.
terrible it is in the States.
Yeah. Oh my God. If we weren't on a podcast, we would talk about that for hours. Yeah. So the funny thing is, like, I would probably, if I had to average it out, I'd probably go to Starbucks more than any other individual coffee chain, especially, or individual cafe or coffee chain. And it's not because I want to, it's because it's available. If you're at an airport, if you're, in a city, I was in Tampa, and I don't know where to go in Tampa for good coffee, but I know Starbucks is going to be consistent.
That is so interesting. So I just have a question. Just pause there for a second. Have you found consumer behavior? So I totally get what you're saying. I personally do not like Starbucks coffee. I really hope no one from Starbucks have listened to this podcast, but that's my honest truth. But sometimes I would choose Starbucks because at least it's predictable. I know what I'm going to get, even though I know that, when I'm a quarter of the way through that iced Americano, I'm probably going to throw it out because every time that it doesn't change, I still don't like it, but I'll still choose it. So have you found consumers are more likely to fall back or default to something that isn't kind of adequate to their standard as long as it's predictable versus take a risk?
Well, yeah, I would say yes, because you don't, I mean, in my experience, I just don't have the time. I'm not sure. Like it's availability. They call it, in the marketing science, they call it mental and physical availability. So what is more mentally available to you? Easy to mind, easy to find. Starbucks is always going to be easy to mind. You're going to remember this is Starbucks, it's going to be coffee, it's going to be this, it's going to be that, because it's so big in your mind. And it's easy to find because they've got physical availability. They're everywhere. So that's how they build repeat customers, which people might call loyalty. So I would be considered, Starbucks' most loyal consumer, not because I want to, not because I like them at all, but because of that availability. And I mean, of course, we don't really love Starbucks. And Australia's greatest claim to fame, perhaps its biggest claim to fame, was making Starbucks bankrupt, which we're all very proud of. That's what I call, and I don't believe in brand loyalty, it's brand laziness. It's more just that aspect of things because it's that consistency that you know what you're going to get. I haven't got time to try something else out. Yes, this might be better, but how much time do I have for that?
How could a small to medium-sized business that's kind of thinking about these things for the first time create that level of availability and, win that quite significant portion of the market that's driven by consumer laziness?
Yeah. Well, and someone said to me, you should be more positive, Clinton. And that was just a general comment. But they also said, maybe you should just use the word efficiency rather than consumer laziness. But I think consumer laziness is more funny. So I like that. I mean, the thing that small brands can do is, first of all, align their messaging to their physical availability. There's a cafe around the corner from me where I live, and they spend a lot of time on Instagram posting things that go out to like New York broadly. And I'm thinking you'd be better off just like chalking the sidewalk. Because then you're targeting people who are actually going to be able to go to your cafe. So align your marketing efforts with your footprint. Like not everyone in New York is going to be able to get to this cafe. They're just going to go with whatever is locally available. That's one thing. But then the other thing is just distinctiveness. This is what the marketing scientists will just go on about forever. Distinctiveness is so much more important than everything else. So you can put meaning into your brand. That is great. You can choose a color that you feel an affinity to. But the first thing is it's got to be distinct. We call it a design screening process in my agency. It's a design screening process where I screen out the colors that other brands use. I screen out symbols that other brands use. And then whatever's left over is what you can play with, because that's how you build memory. And I think back about sort of imagining us on the savannah in Africa. And the reason our minds notice things that are distinct is because that is important information biologically. The animal that notices that the grass over there in distance looks different to how it looks yesterday, that's the animal that survives. So noticing distinct things is important for us. evolutionarily, and that's why you should bring it into your branding.
That makes total sense. And so from your definition, define distinct. How would they go about creating a distinct brand?
It's thinking about all of your brand elements and assets. And the classic thing that I get asked when people ask me what I do, the branding agency, and they're like, oh, you create logos. And I'm like, yeah, that's like a very tiny part of it. But you're not wrong. I do create logos. It's one of those things. It's fine. That makes sense. That's what you'd associate with branding. But it's also like mascots. Can you create a furry creature that is somehow associated with your brand that people can connect with? That's a great way to build distinctiveness, because faces are something that we remember really well, obviously. Like, that's an important thing for humans to remember faces. So if you can put a face with your brand and you can create a cartoon character that has a face, that's a great way to build memorability if you're not using an actual person. The other thing is, I mentioned it before, but colors is obviously a really important way and the easiest way to create distinctiveness. Just see what your competitors' colors are and just cross those off your list. The thing that I usually deal with a lot is blue. People want to be a blue brand because blue means calm and trust and all those important things. It does mean that, but in a marketing context, distinctiveness takes primacy. If you were to create the world's first bank tomorrow, I would definitely create that bank color to be blue. The second bank after that should not be blue because it's just not going to work. So that's the other thing. So colors, shapes, distinctive taglines, of course, a tagline that's memorable, imagery that's memorable, just creating all those things. Just have a look at the competition. The amount of times, this is sort of my favorite party trick, actually, when someone shows me a brand and then I'll Google image search their sector and I'll be like, here is all of your brand's competitors and they all look exactly the same as you. And that was just from like a 10-second Google image search. So you're not going to stand out. You're not going to be memorable. And this distinctiveness obsession that I'm going on about, I feel like I'm going on about this a lot. So maybe I should give some backstory or some history to it. They've been studying this at mostly the Ehrenberg Bass Institute for Marketing Science, which is based out of the University of South Australia. But it's also been confirmed by marketing institutes and marketing science researchers in the UK as well. They've just tracked brands over like 50 years. Like, this is longitudinal studies. And they've found that the ones that are more successful are the ones that don't look like their competition.
Interesting. It's the same in for an artist, right? Like, so when you're just looking at a personal brand, individual celebrities always really trying to go for something that is super distinct, really stand out, whether it's an outfit or something they're known for. And that's what helps them build their recognition, their profile, their niche. Or when a celebrity is trying to rebrand themselves, like Miley Cyrus, great example, really going to the other end of that pendulum to be, known in a different way. So if you've ruled out in your thinking brand loyalty as an idea, what about the correlation between brand and identity? Do you believe that if there isn't brand loyalty, that we really don't have an identification with that brand and we don't make it a part of who we are? Or what's your kind of take on it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's a good pushback that I imagine people would have. We're very functional with it. So, a brand will be signaling something about us. And, usually it signals that we're either intelligent, we're very, very smart, and we can choose the right curated look for ourselves, or we have resources. They're the two things we're trying to say to other people. So the brand is saying one of those two things: mate with me because I have resources, or mate with me because I'm smart. That's basically what we're trying to say with all brands. So you can swap them in and out. And one of the brands that everyone says, well, when it comes to brand loyalty, they usually bring up the example of Apple. And in the research, Apple is the only product globally which has a slightly higher degree of brand loyalty beyond its market share. So that's the thing. When you correlate between market share and loyalty, when you account for market share, it just equates to, well, they're bigger, so more people use them. That's usually what loyalty comes down to. Apple's a little bit higher up, and it's probably because of the ecosystem, the whole iOS operating system. Because if you really think about it abstractly, if there was a luxury phone brand that had, really great technology and signaled luxury, and it was like 80% of the cost of an iPhone, like I'm even imagining myself, I'd be interested in buying that because I could save some money. The thing is, there are competitors. I mean, Samsung is trying to be luxury, but they just don't quite get the nuance of luxury that Apple does. For instance, they've got that folding phone, which is double the thickness of an iPhone. And I just think the poor people at Samsung, like no one ever thought, do people want bulgy things in their pocket? Like no one ever asked that question. It's like Apple that would be their first question. They'd be like, how thick is it in your pocket? Like, how cool do you look carrying this in your pocket? That would be like their number one question. But Samsung's like, what's the coolest technology we can create? And it's like, well, that's true. You can create cool technology. What does it feel like on a human?
Or maybe they were asking the question, but the kind of the prioritization of the compromise was made differently. That's really interesting. Like as a brand, I guess, what are your non-negotiables? What are the things that you absolutely will not compromise on? Do you find that's generally a process that you go through with your clients?
Yeah. I do this list of, I call it things we could always do, or things we could do and things we would never do. And it's actually a great way to test the brand concept when I come up with it. So it shows the nuance, and I really try to push them on like the little things that they would do that are close, but they would never do them because it's not about what their goal is. I've got to use an example. I was thinking I shouldn't use this example, but I won't use the name of the company, but they're a LGBTQ travel company, and they're about, happiness and travel and promoting community and social travel, which is great. And one thing that I suggested they would do would be to raise funds for queer nonprofits in developing countries that were destinations that they would actually go to. I said, so that's something you would definitely do, but something you would never do would be to host a seminar on discrimination in developing countries, because that's not joyful. It's not going into your joy sort of process, but helping people and raising money. And it's just like a slight difference, but it's good to sort of push people on these things to make sure that they're constantly living their brand.
I think that's a really interesting distinction, right? And in your thinking, because it makes total sense, is the foundation of that really like, how do you want your brand to make people feel? And if you're wanting people to feel uplifted and joyful, because that's where you want them to make a buying decision. If you then introduce this idea of people are being discriminated against.
Yeah, absolutely. I probably should have said at the start, but I'm so glad I'm talking to you because you point out the things that I'm getting at. It's all about emotions. It's completely an emotional connection because we're connecting with a story, and the way we remember things, the way we feel about things, it's emotional relief. And, I even talk about this in B2B context because yes, it's a B2B product, but maybe your frustration is frustration. And, a company's trying to solve that. I branded this auditing firm, Alice.cpa, and we talked about, they do financial audits. Like you can't think of anything less exciting in some ways. And it's sort of like going to a dentist, but they do financial audits for the purpose of helping startups get funding. And I was like, so actually what we're really selling here is the excitement of getting to the next level in your startup and getting that funding. So let's talk about the startup. Like McDonald's doesn't talk about the abattoir. They talk about the burger. So let's talk about the excitement as the outcome. And so we totally tap into that emotion, even though that's a total B2B play.
Yes. I mean, this is so our language. 80% of our decisions are emotionally driven, So if you're wanting to drive any kind of behavior, specifically consumer behavior, of course, emotions going to have to play a role in that. What are maybe some practical first, maybe 3 questions a business owner could ask to really, nut down on, get into the nitty gritty of what they're wanting people to feel when engaging with their brand, if that's not already kind of a known concept to them?
Yeah. So in trying to understand what people are feeling, it's sort of obvious, but just ask people how your product made them feel. And that's probably a good starting point to then talk to other people about how you're making them feel. And it might take a few questions because the first answer will be, oh, it made me feel great, which is not really, an emotion. It's like, well, how did it make you feel great? Or why did it make you feel great? Or what did it help you achieve? And then you can tap into that. I mean, that's where we got excitement for that auditing firm, because we talked to startups that they had helped and they were like, yeah, we were just so relieved to like get the funding and get to the next level. So talking to your customers is a great point. And just, this is why I do a lot of interviews with brands to try to understand, also what makes them excited to help their customers? Like what excites you? Like where do you feel joy the most in your work? And what's that moment? So for me, it's, helping people feel seen. That's the emotion that I really connect with. So then that's something that I want my customers to feel too.
Yeah, I love that. Simple, but, so often overlooked, I think. Even I'm sitting here thinking, like both ways, what our customers feel. And as a team, where do we feel the most? Where's the biggest emotional emphasis when we're serving our customers? I think that's a really valuable question to ask. And so what has all of this taught you about humanity and about society at large?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that going into the real marketing science research, I feel better about people because I feel like people, they don't care that much about products as much as we think they do, which is why they need, like, branding doesn't matter, which is why it matters so much. People don't think about it a lot. So you need to make it simple and you need to make every touch point, every little nuance matter, every detail right, because people are just not thinking about it. So that made me feel good that people are mostly thinking about their relationships and their life and their ambitions, which is good. The other thing that I really want to share that I discovered in the research, because I want to dispel this myth, positive word of mouth is more common than negative word of mouth. And there's this myth out there that negative word of mouth is more common. But people like sharing good things with each other. Like they like sharing joyous experiences. They don't want to share things that are negative, that reflect badly on themselves. So I just feel like there's more hope for people when you understand marketing science, because I feel like there's a lot less dishonesty out there. There's a lot more positivity and there's a lot less focus on material things.
Yeah, it makes sense. It really does ring true. Just self-reflecting, when you go to a great restaurant or you've had a great experience with a company. I know for me, I'm way more inclined to share that with the people I care about and to recommend that business or that brand to them. Yeah, which is definitely, I think, contradictory to a lot of people's ideas around us being very kind of negatively oriented, like our negative bias will dominate in every conversation all the time. And it's not necessarily true. So that's great.
And I think you could even test that yourself, like thinking about the product recommendations that you make versus the negative product recommendations. And you'll probably find that there's going to be a lot more positive ones than negative ones.
Yeah, unless you'll get some kind of kick out of going and doing reviews on Yelp that tear businesses apart or something like this. Those people are definitely out there too.
They really are. And then, but then the other thing is, like, even when you look at those reviews, we're often a bit like understanding because we're like, oh yeah, I know that kind of person. I know that person who would write that kind of nasty review. Like, yeah. So we take all those with a grain of salt.
Clinton, I've loved this conversation. I've learned a lot, which I'm really grateful for. What are the ways that these guys can connect with you, your work, your branding agency, and learn more about what you have to offer?
Yeah, sure. Great. Well, go along to my website, theconnected.agency. Have a look at me there. I'm also on LinkedIn as, Clinton Plus. That's my Instagram handle as well. I was going to say Twitter, but I don't use that anymore for obvious reasons. Yeah, so hear me out, reach out to me. Please reach out to me on my website or wherever you can find me.
And we'll put all those links in the show notes. But Clinton, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been great. Thank you so much. It's really great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening, my friend. If you enjoyed the show, please let us know by leaving a review or sharing the episode with someone you love and expanding this conversation as far and wide as possible. If you're looking for a community to have conversations with about global affairs, please jump in our Telegram group or join our free think tanks. Thanks for being a part of the shift towards a love-based civilization. We'll see you in the Telegram group or in the next episode.